Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. In this episode, we're talking to Nate Jennings about the Yom Kippur War, specifically about insubordination in the command chain. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
At Systematic, we make the coordination of fires simple by unifying your operational and fires missions plans into one C4 ISR management platform. The Sit-Aware Fire Support module increases your responsiveness by reducing the time between target identification and fire's response, while ensuring full collaboration between all elements involved in the operation. Sit-Aware is trusted by more than 50 nations worldwide, including 17 NATO nations, and is the world leader in command and control software. Sit-Aware is trusted by more than 50 nations worldwide, including 18 NATO nations, and is the world leader in command and control software.
The Yom Kippur War in 1973 was a crucial moment for military thinking. It played a significant role in the US military intellectual renaissance after Vietnam and underpinned what we now think of as the Western way of war. It was a near-run thing, though, particularly at the outset, with Israel challenged in both the north and the south, facing multiple belligerents who were all seeking the destruction of the Israeli state through sheer mass of military might and bypassing the advantages of air power that Israel had demonstrated in the Six-Day War in 1967 and, at that stage, which remained the mainstay of doctrine for national security. Now, there are accounts of 1973 that gloss over many of the realities of that campaign in order to reinforce the lessons that some militaries wish to draw out. And command and control might just be one of those. It's often used in Western professional military education as an illustration of how mission command should work. But the reality was somewhat different. The command structure inside the IDF in 1973 was a cauldron of disagreement, differences, personality clashes, and mistrust. So there's much to learn from the conflict, but not all those lessons will be necessarily welcomed and acknowledged. To get into some of this, I'm joined by my old friend, Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Jennings from the US Army. He's currently an associate professor at the US Commander General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. While Nate's academic credentials are excellent, he has a background in the cavalry, starting as a gunner and driver in a scout platoon, then as a platoon leader and troop commander in combat conditions during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Nate went on to West Point as an assistant professor, became a planner during the Afghan years, and wrote doctrine at the US Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate. Nate's views are his own. They don't reflect those of the United States, the US Army, or any other institution, and I need to make that clear right at the start. Nate, listen, welcome to the show. I think what would be really useful to talk about here is the big counterattack from the Sinai in 1973, which is in the Southern Theatre, and comes after sort of quite a bit of back and forth after the Egyptians attack, and there's canal crossing and all the rest of it. But for those that aren't aware, can you just give us a brief synopsis of what happened before we get into the sort of C2 of it all?
Yeah, Peter, thanks for having me. Pleasure to join you today. So the moment of the counter crossing by the IDF across the Suez Canal happens after about 10 days of back and forth, severe losses, and there's tremendous strain on the command relationships between the forward commanders who are leading the divisions and then the theater and national level commanders who are managing the larger war effort. So in the first 3 days of the war, Israel's surprised in both the Golan and on the Suez Canal by Syrian and Egyptian offensives. They suffer badly in about 3 days of fighting. Their counterattacks are devastated, but then they go on defense and they have to reconstitute and they begin to fight back. In the north, after a few days, they retake the Golan Heights, and then they invade Syria proper and begin to stabilize that theater. In the south, though, it's a much more difficult situation. The Egyptian defense along the canal, they've moved across and established a seemingly impenetrable anti-air and anti-armor defense, and they're digging in. And so in order to end the war in Israeli terms, the IDF has to figure out how to do a counter-crossing, take the war into the Egyptian rear area, and paralyze their fighting forces. Then they'll be at an advantageous posture to begin negotiations. So this is a difficult task, and the trigger for it is that they need the Egyptian armored operational reserves to cross over. So if you can imagine crossing the Suez Canal and then getting counterattacked by two full-strength armor divisions, That's not an enjoyable prospect. And so they're waiting and waiting for the right moment. And then the Egyptians will oblige them. They send those armored divisions across because President Sadat orders the Egyptian military to conduct a further offensive into the central Sinai. It's foolish. His generals advise against it, and it's a total disaster. They lose about 260 tanks in about a couple hours of fighting. Up to this point, note, the Israelis have lost at least 500 main battle tanks. For a small country, this is a massive and unacceptable rate of attrition. They've perhaps lost at least 50 attack aircraft. So the task of countercrossing is complicated by also the requirement that they have to limit their losses while doing so. A tall task for any commander trying to devise his operational art in this circumstance. So after defeating the Egyptian attack into the Sinai, there's another counterattack by the Egyptians that they defeat, and now the Israelis commence the countercrossing. And this is where we bring in our characters that will bring out these frictions in command relationships. So the commander assigned to execute the crossing is Major General Ariel Sharon. He's famous. He later becomes Prime Minister of Israel. He's in command of the 143rd Reserve Armored Division. It's probably the most intact division of the 4 in the Sinai theater. He also has a reputation for being, frankly, insubordinate, a maverick, going his own way. He's very aggressive. He previously was the Sinai theater commander and devised this plan, actually. So he understands very intimately how to do this, and he's chomping at the bit to go. And that's going to place him in tension, though, with the theater commander, which is a guy named Major General Gonen, who's then kind of replaced by a previous commander named General Bar-Lev. This is complicated because Gonen isn't officially fired, so they're like an acting co-command team with Bar-Lev having the senior authority. So that's going to complicate things, and neither of them likes Sharon. There's personal dislike there, and they don't trust him. We could further complicate the Israeli, the IDF chief of staff. He also dislikes Sharon and doesn't trust him. And then we can bring in a final character, the defense minister, Dayan. He actually has a little bit more of an ambivalent view of Sharon. He also worries about his aggressiveness, but he also appreciates it. And so throughout the war, Sharon is sometimes going to go over the heads of his general officers that he reports to and go directly to the defense minister to get permission to do tactical operations. And you can imagine that's not a good dynamic for any chain of command. By the way, at the same time, because of mistrust, Bar-Lev and Gonen will actually reach into Sharon's command and communicate directly with brigade commanders, sometimes just to make sure Sharon isn't giving them orders that would contradict the theater command orders. So it's really a mess. Some of these guys have worked for each other before the 73 war. So, for example, the theater commander Gonen, he used to work for Sharon previously. Now Sharon works for him. So some interesting friction introduced. I'll finally add, Sharon is known to have political aspirations. He's somewhat aligned with one of the opposition parties at the time. And so the theater commanders, the chief of staff, they worry he's seeking glory on the battlefield, going to be too aggressive in order to build his political portfolio for a future run for office. So all of that is informing the decision-making and the planning for an incredibly risky operation. After suffering tremendous losses, the IDF has to penetrate the Egyptian canal defense, move at least 2 divisions across, and then maneuver to conduct a breakout and isolate the Egyptian forces from the rear. And it's going to prove to be fractious and bitter. Sometimes Sharon will disobey orders. Sometimes the senior commanders will have to basically assert their dominance. But in the end, the team will get it done.
So in a sort of hierarchy terms, Sharon is commander of armoured division, the 143rd. It's a reserve armoured division. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And he's got bits attached to him like a parachute brigade and various others. But above him, effectively, you've got Southern Theatre Command, which is Goron and Bar-Lev, however we decide to sort of divvy them up. But Southern Theatre Command, above them is the IDF Chief of Staff, Elazar, and above them, the IDF Defense Minister, Moshe Dayan, and then it's the Prime Minister at the time was Golda Meir, right? So it's a fairly standard hierarchy that we'd expect. And because it's broken out, the sort of the fight to the north and the south, Elazar is looking at the two fights, Moshe Dayan is looking at the two fights, but everyone else is looking at the south, right? Sharon is clearly right at the tactical edge of this, but Bar-Lev, Gonan, and the actors in the south are purely focused on the southern theatre. They're not distracted by the north, right?
That's correct. And we can bring in an additional relational dynamic, and that's the competition between Sharon and the other main division commander, Major General Bren Adan, who's also very good. He's an expert. He's actually been the Armored Corps, schoolhouse commander. And so he's also looking to make a name for himself. And you'll have a bit of a contest between them. Who gets to be the breakout division? Who's going to have to do some of the unenviable logistical tasks versus who gets to go after the SAMS batteries? So there's all these cross currents of relational tensions that are informing both the planning and the execution of the operation.
And I think it's just worth the listeners understanding that Sharon wasn't there at the kickoff, right? So there was a sort of tripwire force of the IDF that was holding the Israeli side of the canal and the Sinai side. There was a tank force, a division that was there that was sort of supposed to hold the line while everyone else raced up. And Sharon and the 143rd were in barracks, right? And they were sort of racing to barracks and forward deployed. A big chunk of the force that became available and the rest of it followed on. And the dynamics, as you would expect at the divisional level, between the commander, his deputy, his chief of staff. I mean, the 143rd was a really smart, well-led, well-run organization with some real punch behind it. They were rolling out in tanks. There was no tank transporters, right? They all rolled on tracks all the way to the contact point, right?
That's right. And the distances aren't that far. One of Israel's advantages here with interior lines throughout this conflict. But yes, the 252nd Armored Division, that's the ready division in the Sinai. It's virtually annihilated in the first 2 days of fighting. On day 3, the IDF activate and deploy 2 reserve armored divisions. And these are not second-tier units in the Israeli order of battle. The reserve divisions are actually just as good or better than the active duty, because every war plan realizes they will be the primary counterattack force. And so you have Sharon's 143rd and then Adan's 162nd both mobilize, and they move down in the fight, but then they take a severe beating in the initial counterattack on the 3rd day of the war. Sharon suffers moderate losses, but Adan's division maybe loses 40% of its tanks in a day of fighting. So all 3 of these divisions have to go into a defensive crouch and spend a lot of effort on reconstitution to rebuild themselves in order to do the counteroffensive that they know must happen in order to, again, empower Israeli diplomacy.
And I guess Southern Theatre Command, Bar-Lev and Gonan are following the plan, right? We'll wait here. The Egyptian armies will come across, we'll decimate them, and we'll move on from there. That was the plan. So they were sticking to it. But a lot of what they were banking on had been completely overturned by events, right? Their reliance on Israeli air power, which they thought was going to be the critical factor. Their belief that the Egyptians didn't have a very good anti-tank capability. They weren't particularly well trained. And actually, the Egyptians came out and fought. They really surprised the Israelis, right? They fought really hard. They did pretty well. They knocked down the tripwire force. I think the Egyptians only took 256 casualties or something during that initial assault. I mean, it was a real change from what the RDF was expecting, and particularly the Southern Theatre, right?
That's right. The Israelis going into the 73 war expect to do the 6-day war again. Blitzkrieg in the desert. Fast-moving attack aircraft followed by armored columns, punch through, defeat the enemy in rapid order with few losses. And it turns out to be exactly the opposite. It turns into an attritional nightmare. For the Egyptians' part, the initial canal crossing is an incredibly well-executed event. They have a purpose-built army to do that. They have a massive engineer corps. They've heavily invested in air defenses provided by the Soviets. And so it goes off without a hitch. They establish their defenses and they know exactly what's coming. Israeli armored attacks, Israeli bombing, and they decimate both of these Israeli strengths. And the third strength, I'll note, was Israeli intelligence. And they used adroit deception operations to counter that. And so after a couple of days of fighting, the Egyptians are in a very strong posture. And so that, again, moves the onus back to the Israelis. How do they react to this? How do you go on offense when you can't afford more attrition? But I want to note, all the Israeli commanders are agreed that a countercrossing has to happen. This isn't just Sharon's idea. The point of contention is going to be how fast to go over, and then, of course, how much of the Israeli armor can you push across without getting more secure bridges. So we can get into the details, but Sharon is going to want to accept a lot of risk using rafts to push his tanks across before the bridges arrive, the tactical bridges. The theater commander is going to want to wait. They say, no, we have to stop sending the tanks, because if you get isolated over there, if there's a counterattack, if we can't have a good sustainment line of communication across the canal, we could lose an entire division. And we've already lost too much. So the point of contention is not whether to do it, it's how to do it.
So let's get to the point we talk about just before the crossing, because Barlev, Gonan, Elazar all described Sharon in various ways, from reckless, unbalanced to independent. I mean, they genuinely thought that this guy was a real risk. And so automatically their backs are going to be up and they're going to slightly oppose whatever he puts forward. But he puts forward a pretty audacious plan, right?
That's right. Early on the 9th, he discovers a gap between the Egyptian Second Army in the north and the Third Army in the south. And he identifies the way is open for a crossing and a breakout. But remember, the Israelis have just suffered unimaginable losses from a small army with a small country. And he's basically told, just wait, we have to rebuild our forces. We're mobilizing. Aid's going to come in from the US. And so he's chomping at the bit, and they're saying, no, wait. And eventually, the trigger that I mentioned is the Egyptian armor coming over the canal to lead that further offensive. After that occurs, now conditions are set. And so they agree, the initial crossing action, early on the 16th of October, infantry and rubber boats, they go across, seize the initial lodgment. It's the events after that that they can't agree on. Sharon wants to move his entire division across, but the route to the crossing point in his rear is not secure. So the heart of the contention is you have the Battle of the Chinese Farm along the route that the engineer convoys towing the bridges have to traverse. The Egyptians can have fire control over it. And if you'd imagine, cumbersome engineering convoys would be easy targets. And the Israelis are struggling to push the Egyptian 16th Infantry Division and the 21st Armored Division off of the route. They have to push them north, away from this route, so the bridges can get through. Sounds like a pretty clear task. It turns into a disaster for the Israelis. The Egyptians are dug in. They're farther south than anyone thought. And Sharon is going to be pushing to do a crossing anyways. His theater command is going to insist on clearing that route, getting that assurance, getting the bridges in place before sending more armor over. So basically, the heart of the matter is Sharon's going to get 20 tanks across using mechanized rafts. Then the command is going to tell him to stop. And over again, he's going to request to push the rest of his division over. They're going to say no. They're actually going to treat him almost like a junior officer, like, you heard me, right? Do you hear what I'm telling you? And they'll come back over and over again to reiterate every few hours, no tanks, no more tanks. And it's a real dysfunctional relationship in some ways.
But Sharon's not happy with that answer, is he?
No, he's furious, and he's going to take it out on them, by the way, in his post-war interviews and memoirs. But what he sees is opportunity. And so this is kind of the frame I use for this in class and in discussions is Sharon is the operational artist. He's at the tip of the spear, and he sees nothing but opportunity. He wants to go. He realizes he's inside the enemy decision cycle if he moves now, and he can achieve this breakout before the Egyptians can react. Because the worst case scenario is they bog down, the Egyptians figure out what's happening and can reorient their armies and conduct a massive counterattack against a vulnerable lodgment. So that's Sharon's perspective. But I want to say he's not entirely right. He's not fully aware how poorly the Battle of the Chinese Farm is going behind him. By the way, this is his own division. And he's not fully aware of how vulnerable the engineer convoys are that have to get the bridges to him. which is his task, by the way, a task he complains about frequently, saying that he shouldn't be responsible for moving bridges. That should be a theater command responsibility. So you have some frustrations that are developing on the logistics side. From the Sinai command perspective, again, they can't afford to send an entire division across and then have it isolated. Remember, an isolated armored force that loses access to fuel and munitions becomes an infantry division very quickly and then will be defeated. And so they have to prevent that terrible outcome. And so they're going to insist that Sharon clear that route, even though his focus is forward looking across the water. And so this is going to be a back and forth throughout the day on the 16th into the 17th until finally the pontoon bridge arrives, it's laid out, and then eventually the next day the giant roller bridge arrives and they push that across. Now the lock is secure, the line of communication across the canal. But by the way, the acrimony doesn't end there. All is not well. Sharon wants to lead the breakout. He is looking for that glory. The command wants Bren Adon to lead the breakout. And to be fair, his division is ready. And so they'll end up doing a passage of lines and being the main effort to maneuver south and isolate the Egyptian Third Army. Sharon decides he wants to go north, try to take Ismailia, isolate the Egyptian Second Army. He's going to end up pushing hard for that. He goes above their heads to the political authorities to get permission to do that. And so Sharon feels like they're trying to put him in a box, keep him just as a guard force at the crossing. He thinks he can play a larger role. Maybe he's trying to seize political glory as well. So that's part of the dynamics informing not just the planning, not just the crossing, but who reaps the glory of the maneuver breakout.
And what's fascinating is when Sharon doesn't get the answer from Southern Command, he then bypasses them and goes to Eleazar, the IDF Chief of Staff, and says, hey, let me do this. When Eleazar refuses, Sharon then goes above him to Moshe Dayan as the defense minister and says, listen, I've got this brilliant plan, let me do it. And Moshe Dayan eventually gives him permission by cutting through the entire chain of command. It's quite a bizarre move. I mean, there's those that argue, as Sharon did himself, that I have a broader picture of the campaign. I know exactly what needs to happen. These guys don't get it. They're stuck in their old ways of fighting. They're stuck in the idea the Air Force will somehow save them and it can't. And I've got the picture. That's how he sells it. This is the existential threat. I'm the only one that can save Israel. And the others, I think, as you say, are talking about we've only got so much force. There's nothing else coming. There's a fight in the north. The fight in the south has been really tough. We've taken a load of hits. We need to preserve some of manpower. Brenner down in the 162nd are good to go. They're the ready group that we need to use. And so this infighting up and down the command chain is really quite unusual, I would have thought.
Yeah, this level of acrimony, probably a little bit unusual. The analogy would be that in 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, if the 3rd Infantry Division commander who's leading the attack, if he got in an argument with the CENTCOM commander, called the chairman of the Joint Chiefs personally from Iraq and pitched his case, didn't like what he heard, and then called the U.S. Secretary of Defense and got permission to do some kind of maneuver. It's really a dysfunctional political alignment, command relationship alignment. But if I want to be fair, it does work, right? So you could also see it as a team of rivals thing where each side, you're kind of have a dialectic where you're getting the aggression of Sharon, pulling, and then the cautionary instincts of the theater command, restraining, and between them, maybe you get a good adjudication of operational tempo.
So, I mean, those above him, a lot of the people above him, particularly at that time, must have thought Sharon was a very difficult commander to have. They didn't want him commander. They didn't want him in their theatre for all his tactical brilliance. But actually, he was a really good divisional commander in terms of his staff worked really well, particularly in the mobilization phase. The 143rd, Sharon's division, the day before the crossing, he's given a parachute brigade led by Colonel Danny Matt and the 55th Reserve Parachute Brigade, the day before the crossing, to integrate into his command team, right? And these guys performed brilliantly.
That's right. So one of the features of this war is that the Israeli armored corps, probably the most experienced force at armored warfare in the world at this time. All of these commanders have had several reps at this, not just training, but actual combat. In the Six-Day War, in the Suez Crisis, they know armored maneuver. So when it comes to building teams, they're very fluid with task organization, adjustment, realignment. And these brigades are going to be swapped around the entire campaign. They're going to build out these divisions to be true combined arms divisions for the crossing. And they're able to just do this in stride. They're able to take fragos and change orders via FM radio, quick huddles, and do it smoothly and operate very adroitly. And so I remain impressed by this ability. And part of it is, again, they're all experienced at this, but they all know each other as well. When they call someone on the radio, they know the other person. Even if they don't like them, they've spent a lot of time in the same room with them. So these are some of the advantages they're playing on that allow them to roll with the punches and recover and then execute this very ambitious plan.
It strikes you whenever you read this history, lots of people apply this idea of mission command to it. It's less about mission command and it's more about, exactly as you say, trust, competency, experience, and really knowing each other on a sort of very personal level. It's more about that than it is about mission command. We like to fit it into the mission command box because it looks and feels nice, but actually there's a lot more to it than a simple philosophy of command and control, right?
Yeah, it's really a negotiation over priorities. Commanders at different levels are going to see different things. They're going to have, just by virtue of their portfolios, differing priorities. And yes, even though there is a chain of command, subordinates have influence. They can manage upwards sometimes, and they're going to have a say as well. So higher commanders have to sometimes negotiate, accommodate lower priorities. And for example, Bar-Lev and Gonen, they try to get Sharon fired in the middle of the operation a couple times. Dayan, even though he has some suspicions about Sharon, he knows he's an aggressive commander that they need at the front. So he says, no, he stays in place. So at this point, the Sinai command has to work with this forward division commander that they don't really like, they don't entirely trust, but they also know they're all on the same side. They're all trying to achieve the same aim. And so it's a matter of how to achieve it. But we wouldn't want to also forget, they all appreciate there'll be some post-war narrative building that will come out of this, and they want to be on the right side of that.
Right. And afterwards, and it's fascinating to read what happens afterwards, the inquiry that's conducted by the Israeli state leads to the sacking of Elazar and Gonen. Dayan and even Golda Meir resign slightly afterwards. The J3, I think, and the J5 are also removed from the Southern Command headquarters, and Sharon starts his meteoric rise up the chain. That's after the fact, but you can interpret it in a number of different ways. I guess it's interesting to look at this and the way that Sharon's insubordination and circumvented the command chain works. But you were saying just before we start recording, we shouldn't look at this as a single point, that there have been other examples of where a similar thing has happened before in history.
Yeah, that's right. This is actually just a quite natural and predictable tension between the operational artist and the theater commander. As I said, the nature of their portfolios are going to demand differing priorities, and they're going to have different vantage points, and they're going to have different conceptions of risk tolerance. So probably the most well-known example of history is in the German invasion of France in 1940. General Guderian wants to push much harder and much faster and farther than the German high command has tolerance for. And he's going to end up in some bitter disagreements, almost identical to Sharon and his higher commanders. And indeed, Guderian will have to do the famous reconnaissance in force, where he actually just continues his advance to the channel, because what he sees in front of him is that the French are discombobulated. Now is the time to attack. If you stop, you'll slow the decision cycle and allow them to recover. And so that's similar. By the way, it happens elsewhere. During the advance on Baghdad by U.S. forces in 2003, we all know about the famous Thunder Run. That was a commander taking initiative that probably exceeded the comfortability of the division theater commander at that moment. But what he saw in front of him was opportunity. This was then Colonel Perkins. So this is a very common theme. It's tension that's inescapable, and the best armies will figure out a way to work through it. The leading subordinate, the operational artist, will go as far as he's able to without getting fired or without disrupting the larger scheme of maneuver. And the theater commander is going to have to apply restraint, control, without losing that initiative and really suppressing subordinate energy.
It's funny, isn't it? It's about the creative thinking. We often think of the creative thinking being the operational commander. Actually, in many cases, it's the tactical commander on the ground right up forward who is the creative genius behind it. The person who's thinking about the risk is the person at the theatre or the operational command who then is really weighing the overall campaign aims, the stretch of resources, the ability to resupply, the engineering challenges that come with it, the extended lines of communication and connection and resupply and support, all these things that sometimes the tactical commander loses in his desire to make the biggest gains possible, right? Risk is a really big issue here.
That's right. That's right. Risk to mission, risk to force. For Sharon, he has a much higher tolerance. He's at the leading edge, and he thinks by moving early and moving quickly, you buy down the risk, actually. The theater commander, he can't afford to lose an entire division. They've already lost more than a division of tanks. These are main battle tanks. The carnage of the 73 war is so remarkable that no one even counts APCs lost. They don't even register because they're losing so many main battle tanks. So this is a different idea of how you manage risk, how you manage risk to your force versus the risk to the overall mission. And again, this tension in any offensive operation, any major offensive, counteroffensive, I think you're going to have some aspect of this between the forward commander, the operational artist, and the theater commander, maybe the land component commander, the JTF commander, a field army commander, who just is going to have a wider portfolio and a wider spectrum of variables to account for.
And what's interesting is that the command culture in the IDF, right through this stage, I mean, they didn't adopt mission command as a principle till the mid-2000s, which is quite a bizarre concept when, in reflecting on IDF operations, we tend to think about tactical brilliance, the taking of commander's intent and making it happen. But they didn't adopt mission command per se as a formal part of their doctrine until the mid-2000s. And yet they were executing it in many ways way before, depending on your interpretation. It's very interesting in that the IDF has a reputation for breeding brilliant tactical commanders who push risk, and not so much for having really good operational and strategic level military commanders. It's never something that they have excelled at. They've brought tactical commanders who've been tactically good at higher levels of rank, but not necessarily the creative brilliance that we saw in Sharon.
Yeah, and I just want to be fair. Those higher level commanders are dealing with some very difficult problems. And so I don't want to be too hasty to penalize them. And by the way, some of those commanders performed with brilliance in previous wars, in the 6-Day War, in the Suez War. So they've all had their moment. But the problem is once the war plan is disrupted by the initial Egyptian attack, once they have those high losses, they're having to devise new plans on the fly. And so I don't know how much to penalize them for that. But definitely the Israeli commanders are at their best when they're out doing tactical fire maneuver.
Nate, brilliant. Thanks so much for sharing your knowledge of this event. If you enjoyed the discussion, Nate wrote a particularly excellent piece on the Yom Kippur War, specifically the Israeli counteroffensive at Suez in 73, which is called Penetrate, Disaggregate and Exploit, which is published in October 2024 by MWI at West Point. And we're going to stick a link to that piece in the show notes. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic. Join your partners and allies already using our cutting-edge C4 ISR sit-aware suite.
We hope you enjoyed the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do subscribe and leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. The episode is produced by AureliusThinking.com as a show for the Wavell Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.